My observation of real estate agents, especially the good ones, is they are entrepreneurial by nature. So they enjoy kind of driving their own ship and getting the rewards out of that. And so they're often on the lookout for something else they can
New
do.
opportunities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, would you say there's a lifespan in real estate?
Depends. Yeah, I think some people reach a lifespan and others, I think it's become such an integral part of who they are and what they do that it is their lifespan. In fact, there's, I think the industry, especially historically, has been an older industry. There's probably a couple of reasons for that.
Yeah.
But one of those reasons is I think for those people who get into it, do well, and really identify themselves as a real estate agent, they love it, and they become known to their community. It's the sort of thing that they can do right into retirement age and even past it.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've noticed in real estate is that when I got into it 10 years ago, I think, or 11, 12 years ago now, I was 21. And I was definitely the youngest person in the office by 20 years.
Yeah,
or 30
exactly.
years even.
Whereabouts were you selling?
I was in Huffman Bay.
Okay, yeah.
And the change, or the thing I've noticed now is there's a lot more people getting into it younger, seeing it more of like a career that they see themselves carrying on through their whole life.
Yeah, it's. I started in 2005, and when I started, I was 18, and you, 20-year age gap. Yeah, for sure.
And you were selling when you started, so you got straight into sales?
Absolutely. Yeah.
How did you find going up to someone and prospecting for them to sell your property, and you're this 18-year-old, probably no facial hair, look like a baby fresh out of college? Yeah,
actually, it would be funny if we can bring up an image of, probably a year or two into my real estate career. You can have a look. Yeah. It definitely was. I look back on it now and I go, oh my gosh, I can't believe anyone trusted me to sell their house.
Totally.
At the time, though, I think, I wasn't probably aware of that image. I think I always was reasonably mature for my age.
Like, I can do this.
Yeah, totally. And I think, a mantra that I've developed, I guess, as part of that experience is that, if you're good enough, you're old enough. If you're good enough, you're young enough. It's actually an industry that doesn't really discriminate. You often hear people sidelined and marginalized, and we've got to try and give everyone a fair go. Well, in real estate, as long as you're capable and you can resonate with the demographic of your audience, of your customers, doesn't matter if you're male, female, old, young, no problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I heard someone talk about that, how real estate is very much an industry that levels the playing field, because you could have a degree or not, you might have a master's in business, but you might totally fail in real estate.
Yep.
You could be someone
and vice versa.
Yeah, exactly.
No masters in flying.
Exactly. You could be totally uneducated. You've struggled in a typical working career. You get into real estate and off you go, and suddenly you're making more money than a CEO.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. And it is. There's all walks of life. I know a Chinese surgeon who does huge business in Epsom and Auckland, and I know an engineer in Whangarei at the top of their game, and then I know someone who never completed high school and was a builder and now owns his own real estate office and done incredibly well out of it. Yeah,
no, it's interesting. Yeah. And so for you, did you didn't go to uni then if you got straight into real estate?
Actually, it was funny enough. So I was actually homeschooled, which is something not a lot of people know about me. And for me, I remember, and others probably listening on this will think back to when you were in high school and thinking about, what am I going to do? And I remember everyone wants to know, what are you going to do with your life? And I think now I look back and go, well, actually, you don't have to try and decide what you're going to do with your whole life. You should probably just think about, what do you want to do for the next 2 years and trial run it. But I really tried to trial run a few things in that kind of last year of high school. So I was taste testing as a sensory panelist at Fonterra, which is good fun. Now I prefer to taste wine, but it still put me in good stead. And I was working as a outbound call operator. And actually one of our clients, or a segment of our clients, were real estate agents. So here I was making outbound calls, basically hustling for appraisal leads for real estate agents. And I was good at it and I enjoyed it. And I remember getting a testimonial back passed on to me through my boss at the time, basically from some agents who had received one of those leads that I'd generated for them, and they'd gone on and listed and sold it the next day. And, huge commission check, thank you very much type scenario. And I remember thinking, man, I should be doing that. So I reached out to a few. I didn't actually talk to the owners of the businesses at the time. I talked to the salespeople themselves to say, hey, what do you think about a young real estate agent getting into it? And I'd seen an article in the paper about a guy, I think he was in Dunedin, who was 18 and doing really well. And I thought, man, all right, that's me. I got to do it.
Yeah.
And I did one paper at Massey to see if I wanted to go down that route. And I continued on. I must have done, I don't know, a dozen or so papers there, but more just out of kind of keeping it sharp rather than trying to get a degree per se.
Yeah, right. And so how did you find the response to people? Did you knock on doors? Like, what did you do to get yourself up and running?
Well, it's really funny. I guess I was very young and coachable, and I still think being coachable is a wonderful quality, having an open mind and being willing to try things that are suggested by, people who are believable. And all the training I had at the time, and we're talking about sort of like 2005, was very much go out and knock on doors. But I guess this is something now that when I'm coaching, I look at, I think you can have some general advice and you can also have specific advice. And indeed, you should take your own wisdom, knowing who you are, what your assets are, what you're good at. I should have continued hustling on the phone, but instead of doing that, initially I went out and started door knocking. And it is how I found my very first listing. I can remember very clearly, I've been door knocking. I talked to so many people. And I think, I was very young, and I don't know if at the door was my best selling feature. And the people that I knocked on the door of, actually I knew them because they were my mate's parents. I didn't know that when I knocked on the door, but then they recognized we had a bit of chit chat, and the lady said, actually, you need to talk to the owners next door. That's an investment property. The tenants have trashed the place. I said, oh, great. Have you got a phone number? And she said, no, but he's a plumber. You'll find him in the yellow pages. So looked up the yellow pages and boom, there was the plumbers, and made the call and got the appraisal. I remember going around to it, my very first one, and Steve Allen, who's an absolute legend, sales manager at Alchika and Palmy, and he said, I can't make the appraisal, just go around with a listing form, fill out as many details as you can, ask questions about what they're trying to get out of it, and whatever you do, make sure you secure an appointment. We will go back together this evening, tell them 7 o'clock. So I did. We went round there and he basically listed it and I just helped.
Yeah, nice.
But it was a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. And interesting that it was the phone call that got you in the door in the end.
Exactly. My thinking is that I came across well on the phone. I was good on the phone. And at that point, when we had the appointment locked in, and then I asked some intelligent questions and was then able to show the backup that I had with Steve, got my first listing.
Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, I think it is a case of doing what you do well, because there's a lot of agents who see someone else doing something and they go, I've got to do that, but it's not something that they particularly like doing or they enjoy doing, and they end up running down this rabbit hole of chasing something that's not a strength.
I agree. Yeah, you've got to work out what works for you. And sometimes getting an idea from someone else is a great way to figure that out. And other times I think it's, being wise enough to reflect on it yourself or discuss it with your coach and kind of work out what your recipe is. There are some pretty consistent threads for real estate agents. I often think of the analogy of a house. All houses have foundations. They all have a roof of some kind. They all have a cladding system. Yeah. But there's lots of different cladding systems and there's lots of different types of roofs and different types of foundations. So I think you've got to have a way of finding opportunities and securing those opportunities. You've got to have a way of, customer fulfillment and actually doing a good job of marketing those properties and actually clearing stock. And you've got to have a great way of interacting with people and all that kind of stuff. But there's so much color and shape there and opportunity to put your own spin on it, which is why I think that freedom is the part that sometimes trips salespeople up, because there's just such a big range of opportunities.
Yeah, you could take any path really around how you grow your business. So, for me, I've always thought the most important thing is the human interaction side of it and putting a person behind, say, the phone, or if you're talking to someone face to face because you're door knocking or you're doing digital content online, you have to show people that you're a person, because real estate already has this perception. I don't know, people have this idea of real estate agents. So you need to humanize yourself as much as you possibly can, as quickly as you can, and show people that you are capable, trustworthy, all of that kind of stuff. Break down all the trust barriers that we have.
Yeah, it's very much a cliche. You have to be yourself. I think if you're really putting on a facade, people will see through that. You've got to operate naturally. And I think real estate naturally attracts people who have good communication skills and good people skills. But it's interesting. I look at some of the top salespeople, and not even necessarily top salespeople, just solid performers. Whilst there's definitely a kind of personality type that the business seems to attract, there are others that fall outside of that. But they all have the ability to, I would say, negotiate, which is, in my perspective, it's communication with a goal. And I think that's why there is a lot of, especially if you look back over the last decade, there's been heaps of talk about the real estate industry being disrupted, the Uber of real estate. And my perspective on that is I think that, especially, when we look at things like AI, which I know is very topical at the moment, that those tools largely help salespeople to be able to scale, to be able to automate things behind the scenes, to be able to give themselves more time. But I think in a way, real estate agents actually, they not only, I think, have developed more of a reputation of professionalism, but they have a greater role of professionalism than, say, 20 years ago. And in my experience, consumers will often have done lots of their own research. They will have been very well educated and informed about facts, but then they still want a trusted sounding board to kind of validate those or make sure that those general things are specific and fit for their purposes. And I think that's quite hard to disrupt per se. And a good salesperson should be able to understand the client, understand the environment in which they're in, understand the client's objectives, and then help them navigate those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting with the increase in technology, because over the past 20 years, I mean, one of the ways that I've looked at it is that a consumer, say a buyer or seller, they have more access to information than they've ever had. And that's created this big shift in terms of education, so to speak. But nobody has disrupted the industry in the sense that you still need real estate agents, and they're still providing value, but there's this idea of, a lot of people question what is the value an agent brings. They've got these huge commissions a lot of the time, and it's what is the value the agent actually brings to the transaction. And I think when you just mentioned negotiation, that's something that until a robot can read your emotions and understand your barriers and know how to ask the right questions and read body language and all this kind of stuff, then it's so difficult to replace that personal element, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really fascinating. I know there is some pretty crazy technological leaps happening. Yeah. So who knows? Maybe it will happen. But as you say, I think that's particularly difficult to train a machine to do.
Yeah, and there's that, do you trust a machine as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, who guards the guards?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a massive conversation to have, far beyond the scope of just real estate.
Yeah.
But back to the scope of real estate in terms of the value that an agent brings, I think it really is specific to each situation, and there is unquestionably a lot of complexity to real estate transactions. There are some that are very straightforward and simple, and many that are more complex than consumers realise until they actually get part the way through that. And certainly the consumers who have got themselves someone that A, is trustworthy and has the ability to help them, and B, is well prepared and actually prepares their case and helps them launch well to the market, definitely gets a better result than a campaign that goes off half-cocked or indeed without that guidance.
Yeah, totally. And I think a lot of people have this idea of, I can just put my property on Trade Me and do it myself. And then people start that process, and maybe in a good market they sell their property because there's so many buyers. In a hard market, it's very difficult because you have to take yourself out of the equation, receiving all of this feedback that might not be what you want to hear. And often that's a lot easier to hear through someone who's filtering it for you. But then there's also this question, which is really hard to measure, which is, how much more is the agent getting for you than you could get by yourself? And at the moment, there's no way of measuring that. And it's just an interesting idea, which would be interesting to hear what people think about that, around how do you measure that? How could it be done? Is it done the right way at the moment?
Here's a question to put to the punters. Is the value of a property a static figure, or is it a variable?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's an obvious answer, but it'd be interesting to see what people say.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I think we're probably aligned on that, but I think that's often a misconception. And it's why, for example, some sellers might choose to list with the agent who says, I can get you such and such a price. And maybe that price is higher than another agent, but it would potentially be a mistake to choose an agent solely based on that figure. Because I think it's more important as to their ability to do some of those other things that we've already talked about. And selecting an agent on those things is going to help you feel more comfortable with your fit rather than just choosing an agent who has quoted the highest price.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, when I used to sell, I would tell people I'm doing the appraisal because I have to. So it was this idea that, I legally have to give you comparable properties about what your house could sell for. But the reality is, even if I have 5 properties that are exactly the same, let's say I'm selling in a development and all the houses are the same, they all sell on the same market with the same agent, but they get different prices. And the question is, why did they get different prices when it was the same market and the same agent, or maybe different agents? But the point being that the reason is because it's a different buyer for every property. And so one buyer is buying it as an investment, the other person's buying it for their family, another's a professional couple, maybe it's a retiree. And because of that, they all see different value in the property. And so the job of the agent, in my opinion, is not to tell you what your house is worth. It's to know how to put the strategies in place to get the best price for you in the current market and to give you the confidence that you're making the right decision with the individual who's in front of you.
Mm-hmm. I think it's quite an interesting one because I think agents often fixate, and certainly if you look at a whole raft of agent marketing, you'll notice a lot of the same vernacular. And I kind of, perhaps just it's time in the industry, but I kind of roll my eyes a little bit when you've got 3 different people all saying, I'm your local real estate specialist and I'll get you the best price.
Exactly. And it's like, how? Why?
Yeah, totally. But it's interesting about the appraisal. It is an industry requirement for the appraisal to be delivered. I think depending on the agent, and once again, agents need to play to their strengths. If you are an expert in your area, then your appraisal is likely going to be better. And when I say better, not necessarily
higher, but more accurate.
Exactly. And even the accuracy element is a challenging one because if you're a salesperson that's pitching the process and explaining how they're going to work for the seller, that means how they're going to work for the seller. So it's not all about price. It's actually about understanding the bigger picture for that seller. And to me, that is about the bigger decisions that they're making as to why they're releasing the property to market. And occasionally there are little pieces to the puzzle which are over and above outside just this specific property. And I think if you're truly consulting with a seller and you have the interest and the ability to actually help them with their overall goals, that's a client relationship that you're going to not only retain but likely build business off the back of because you're going to be instrumental in actually helping them go where they want to go. And the appraisal itself is a great opportunity for a salesperson to demonstrate expertise, how well they understand that local market, rather than saying with great certainty, I know I will get you X, or you're never going to get more than X and Y. And I think it's an interesting one. The salesperson might be right, but they could equally be wrong.
Yeah, and it's often the way they deliver that message, right? Because some people come and they go, I will get you this price, and then they don't get in that price because the market changes or they've misappraised it for whatever reason. And then in the industry, there's this trust barrier that's been created, or this trust issue, I should say, that's been created because people go, oh, the agent told me I would get this, and then I only got this price. And in the current market, especially, that's even more so. And it's not necessarily the agent's fault. It's the fact that the market's changed and maybe it changed quicker than anybody expected.
Totally. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Actually, there's a few facets there. One, we're talking about market dynamics. And if you're preparing an appraisal based on yesterday's information today to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, in a rising market, the agent's always going to look good. In a falling market, they're not going to look so good. And that dynamic is prevalent. Even sellers who think in the current market that they're being really realistic because they know what their neighbours sold a month ago and it was a lot less than what they thought they would have got. They're going, okay, well, we still really have to sell, so we know we're being realistic. If that market is still falling, then by the time a month, 2 months has gone by and they're actually now in a transaction phase, the market may still be even lower than they realise. And
then they're playing catch up the whole time.
For sure, yeah. So it's definitely an interesting element to it. And then the other aspect of outside of that market dynamic, I think, as you say, with the residential sales market, there is often emotion tied up, and certain people, for their reasons, place a higher value on a property than the next person. And I think a good agent is able to spot some of those things that are likely to press buyers' buttons and do a good job of highlighting them to really target the right market. And they should have the right methods to create some leverage points to help in that negotiation to work on the side of the seller.
Exactly. And a lot of that comes down to asking the right questions. I know a lot of interactions I've had is, you're being sold to the whole time. But it's how do you step back and ask questions to get the information that you need to then have a meaningful conversation with someone?
Yeah, and it's not just an interrogation asking questions either. I think you've got to be quite alert to the things that they're saying or not saying, and actually, if you're able to sort of slip out of straight salesperson mode and be a human for that interaction, and as long as you know what you're doing, those other things are kind of natural anyway. You kind of naturally know the pieces of the puzzle piece together. And I guess if you're a salesperson and you're still in growth mode and figuring some of that stuff out, the more quickly you can put yourself into a buyer's shoes and understand everything that they need to consider in a purchase, and the more different shoes you can walk in like that, the more valuable you'll be, A, to sellers, but also to buyers and helping them buy well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it makes a lot of sense when you talk about it. It makes so much sense, and so it's interesting why in the industry there is this. I don't know what I'd call it, but it's the consumer, or the vendor, the seller, the purchaser. They have one. A lot of people have a perspective of real estate agents, right? But there's a lot of good agents who are doing exactly what you're talking about, and they're doing it well. And so it's interesting about how they all kind of...
Well, mate, let's talk about the elephant in the room. You keep sort of dancing around slightly about the perspective. I mean, I don't know what the list is of trusted people, but I imagine that real estate agents are not at the top of the list.
No, exactly. This is it. They're probably somewhere near the bottom from all the surveys that I've seen.
Yeah, I think there's some good reasons for that. And there's a lot of legislation that came through in 2008. I think it was put into play in 2009 with the Real Estate Agents Act. And that really, if you go through that, and as a deliverer of training and indeed, working in the industry, I'm often struck by what is a real tension between a duty to the seller. So real estate agents normally are engaged by the seller and they have a fiduciary obligation to act in their best interests. But the legislation in New Zealand creates a duty of care to treat buyers fairly and to tell them about anything that could be material to their purchase. So actually, real estate agents have a very challenging role there because there is a natural tension between those two things. And in other countries, there are buyers agents and sellers agents, which relieve some of that conflict of interest.
Yeah, because someone's representing both sides.
Totally. And so it's quite interesting because there is, I think, a perceived conflict of interest, and it can indeed be one, but it's a fine line to dance there. But the caveat, and for consumers watching this, if the salesperson is engaged by the seller, they are working for the seller. But smart salespeople and salespeople that are operating ethically will be trying to help you to make sure that you understand what it is that you're buying, and you should be able to buy with confidence. And also just realize that in them helping you purchase, they are working for the seller to effect the sale.
Yeah, it is an interesting dynamic. And I think a lot of companies now, they've put systems in place as well to make sure that the agent is asking the right questions of the seller to then pass that information on to the purchaser. Like disclosure obligations about weather tightness and structural integrity and, all of that kind of stuff. And so I think like you said, since the Act, the industry has come a long way to rebuilding that trust. Interesting that you touched on this idea that, overseas you often have a different system where you have an agent who represents the seller and an agent who represents the buyer. They're both paid separately by each party. Do you think we could have that in New Zealand or should have that in New Zealand?
Yeah, there is a little bit of it in New Zealand, but it's not prevalent. And it's fascinating because, and I've had this discussion recently with someone who's kind of going, is there a gap in the market for it? I'm not convinced that there is per se. However, at the same token, I think, there could be. It's kind of it's certainly not something that's taken off massively here, but there's definitely some case studies abroad where it's common.
Yeah, because it's interesting. If I was, say, a first home buyer buying a property for the first time, so that means I don't have an agent who represents me, and any agent who is taking me from property to property in the current system technically is representing the seller because they're being paid by the seller. And I would imagine that having someone who I pay to find me a good deal would actually benefit me quite a lot. Because say my budget is, I don't know, $600,000 for a new house. Couldn't get much in Auckland these days for that price, but outside of Auckland you could. So let's say $600,000. If I had an agent who could negotiate a price, let's say I paid that agent, I'm just making figures up here, $10,000. But because they're doing this all the time, it's literally the bread and butter, and they are a great negotiator, could they negotiate so that I only have to spend $550 or $560 because they're so good at negotiating? And so I've spent $10,000. I've probably saved $50,000 because I've got somebody representing me who knows how to negotiate and knows what a good deal on the market is.
It's a great question, and I think in my mind there's a few things going on. Firstly, if you're a consumer watching this, I'd be really interested to know, would you hire someone, pay them as a buyer's agent to do that, enter into an exclusive agreement, just like a seller does, that when you purchase a property, regardless of how that's affected for a certain time frame, you're paying this person who you've hired to represent you. And then I guess the other question is to salespeople out there, what's your perspective on this? I think something that I'm aware of from just having listening to, there's a well-known buyer's agent operating in Sydney. It runs a podcast, and I was curious. So I had to listen to that just recently. And one of the reasons that they've had good appetite for picking up on that is that a lot of those real blue chip suburbs, high-end properties, tightly held, private individuals are transacted off market. So if you don't have a great relationship with every single real estate agent, then it's unlikely that you actually get to see the properties that you want to buy. And it's quite hard for that one person to have a great relationship with all these different agents. So they're actually, in that particular market, the agent who's acting for the buyer is helping them to surface opportunities they wouldn't otherwise find. And it's interesting listening in terms of the successful sales and where they feel they were able to buy for under market. And they're not always able to buy for under market, but they're still paid. But they were mostly off market deals. I think that speaks a little bit to the importance of having a salesperson represent you in the sale and run a great marketing campaign and potentially method of sale that's there to protect the seller and to ensure that they are able to achieve a fair market price with the potential for a premium.
Yeah. Well, it would be interesting if that change happened, because instead of having, let's say you, at the moment, you have a buyer who's working with an agent, but that person, they might be doing a conjunctional sale with the listing agent. Technically, both of those people are working for the seller, so they're on the same side, actually. And so to have two agents who are trained in negotiation, both representing someone, it would be interesting to see how that changes the dynamic and even the prices that come out of that for the purchaser and for the seller.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, and I'm aware of some agencies where you have a salesperson who has introduced the buyer and the listing salesperson. And those people, even without going into the conjunctional layer, which is similar, sometimes those selling salespeople talk about it, my buyer, I'm working for the buyer. And actually they're contracted and work for the seller, and they should be. In most cases, they still are. But in some cases, I think there is some tension there, and salespeople, I'm sure, listening to this will say, yeah, exactly. And definitely when you get to that conjunctional scenario where you have a salesperson introducing a buyer and working conjunctionally, they're entering into an agency relationship with that client, and they're bound by the same fiduciary obligation to represent that seller. So it's an interesting one.
Oh, it's fascinating.
And you can see why there's a bit of a breakdown of trust.
Yeah, because the thing is, if you are an agent and you've built a relationship with a buyer, and then you then find them a property, you're now representing the seller, even though you've taken that buyer to 20 properties. And that's the way it works in New Zealand right now. So it is a very challenging dynamic, because you have to, technically, I think you, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you might even need to tell the purchaser that you're representing the seller if they're not aware of that. I'm not too sure, but Do you know?
Yeah, they should be
do
aware.
Need to, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think most people are aware of that they are being paid by the seller.
Yeah, being paid by the seller, but are they aware that
them.
they're representing the seller? That's the question.
Yeah, and I wonder if this is an element where, you were saying before about the reputation of the industry, and I'm curious.
Yeah.
For example, as an auctioneer, I often announce that I'm working for the seller, and I am. But it's interesting because working for the seller and effecting a sale, there's often a lot of common ground in making those two things happen. And I think an agent who's doing a good job helping a buyer to find a property. And I remember when I was working as a salesperson, I'd tell a buyer, I'll do my best to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve with the purchase and help you to buy the right property. And I work for the seller. I'm protecting their interests. So I'm going to try and get a great opportunity for the seller.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, the best real estate transactions are win-wins anyway. The seller, you want them to feel like they've got a good deal and they're able to move on with their goals, and you want the purchaser to feel like they have bought a property of their dreams or investment or whatever it is that meets their goals as well.
Personally, that's why I like auction as a method of sale, because in that scenario, I remember this where I went in after the auction had concluded, and the winning purchaser said, "Oh gosh, do you think I've paid too much?" to the salesperson. And the salesperson was about to launch into a conversation about other properties that had sold and all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, hey, there's somebody else who missed out $500 less than you, and I know they were gutted. I saw the look on their face. Do you want me just to go and sell it to them? Oh, no, we're happy. So it's great to have that transparent forum to help facilitate that transaction.
Yeah. Auction's an interesting conversation in itself, because there's a lot of agents who will just sell by auction, and they go, you have to sell by auction every time, and they have their strategies around that. And then you have agents who never do auctions, and then you have the middle ground where they kind of chop and change. So you're an auctioneer yourself. What do you think about auctions as a method of sale? Is it the only way to sell?
It's definitely not the only way to sell, clearly. Yeah, I like it. That's why I do what I do. I think everyone needs to make up their own mind about it, and there's definitely pros and cons to every method. And some people will say that it's market specific. Some people will say that it's market dynamics specific. I think it's probably a case of, the right tool in the wrong hands sometimes. So I do think it's a method of sale that you want to make sure you've got someone who knows what they're doing with it. And it needs the property needs to be well marketed to be able to run that auction successfully. Alongside that, though, I kind of look at some of the things recently, and let's talk about, the time of recording. We've come off the back of what would have been probably the most hot sellers market I've ever seen after COVID. Interest rates greatly reduced. So, I mean, the big dynamics that affect the property market, the cost of money and the supply of money. So the cost of money, it was so cheap, down at like 2.2% to be able to secure a loan. And the supply of money, when they took away the LVR rates, all of a sudden there's more money into the market. So of course, there's a direct inverse relationship between interest rates and property prices. Exploded. And in that scenario, I see auction 100% delivering those results in terms of real-time market growth. You could literally see that buyers were paying more than what they'd recently just seen something sell for last week, and being prepared to do so because they knew that there were 4 other people who were also prepared to do so. And they were basically justifying, well, I'll pay what the property's worth tomorrow in order to secure it today. And they're predicting where it goes. And the same dynamic kind of exists in the current market, where you've got buyers who are wanting to pick up a well-priced property. They want to feel like they've got value, and they're delivering that value based off, well, they've seen something that sold last week. And so that's a new high watermark. They're going, well, we've got more interest rate rises coming. At the time of this recording, we've just had another 50 basis points put onto the OCR. That was already priced in by purchasers who were looking last week. So that's kind of like they're once again going, well, the market's going to be here tomorrow, so I'm going to pay this price today based off that. And where this becomes important, and why I go, I think, if I was selling, and I can really only say for myself, what I would do if I was selling, I would use an agent, in the sense that I've only sold 2 properties, and both times I engaged an agent to help me with that for a variety of reasons, which we've already talked about. But a big part of that being an arm's length and someone who can really handle that and knows the local market well. And the same thing with the auction scenario. In a marketplace which is in a declining market, or where buyers have so much power because there's more choice, why wouldn't you want to take some of that power away from them and force their hand to make an unconditional commitment? So if you've got a property that comes to the market through any other method, buyers can make an offer with contingencies and conditions in place. Whereas if they want to secure it at auction, they have to make an unconditional commitment. And whether that be before auction with a pre-auction offer, and the risk of competition on the day forces their hand and they're willing to pay, from the seller's perspective, a great price to secure that unconditionally prior to auction, that might be the right thing. Or indeed to have that competition on auction day, or post-auction having had the benefit of a few weeks where buyers have had to evaluate the property on its own merits as opposed to being influenced by a price. And I guess I'm from what I would consider the new school of auctioneers. I don't go pitch it low, watch it grow, misleading purchases. I think we're better off to just say, hey, here's what's happening in the market, make your own decisions on value, but sell the vendor's motivation. And a lot of the agents that I'm talking with are telling me that they are getting better inquiry and traffic through their auction properties because buyers are going, well, this could be a good opportunity. The vendor's probably, committed to making this happen. And so rather than wasting their time with other properties, they're looking at those. So my advice to salespeople is to connect with a vendor, gain permission to explain their motivation, highlight that to attract purchasers, put them into a competitive situation if you can, and have that sold unconditionally, as opposed to entering into a contract in the first week for what you think is great money and perhaps is, but that isn't real, because they've just been re-rated by the bank and it falls over and you've just wasted, another couple of weeks in the market. And as you said before, chasing it down, that could be far more costly. So they're a bit of a rant on why I like it, but I guess it's something that I've thought a lot about. And for those reasons, I think there's some general guidance there. But once again, if you're a salesperson listening to this, I would say you can probably auction just about any property, but you probably can't auction every vendor. And I think that's the important piece about actually taking the time to understand their situations, their preferences, their experiences, what's important to them, understanding what they're trying to achieve and their environment they're doing it, and putting together a recommendation that actually matches up to them.
Yeah. And also I think just as we're talking about this, one of the things that I would find interesting is purchasers listening to this is this idea that all an agent wants to do is squeeze the most out of me, right? And they're using this thing and at the end of the day, the agent is representing the seller. But I also think that, say you're a buyer and you've been driven up in price in auction, or an agent has done a great job negotiating for the seller in a different method to get a good price. I think if the agent does a good job in the way they communicate with the purchaser, that the purchaser's still really happy with what they've bought ultimately and don't end up with this, purchaser's remorse, which I've heard of in the market as well. Because like, for example, the property I sold in, it sold for 2.15. The purchasers even rang me, and the market's now dropped since then, so they could go, we paid too much money for this. But they even rang me 3 months later, 6 months later, and were like, we love this property so much and we're so happy here. And it's because money is only one part of the equation. But what would you say to purchasers who feel squeezed by agents and auctions and pressure and, this kind of thing? Do you think it's just part of the process, or do you think it's I
think it's going to be a very specific experience. Yeah, depends on who they're working with and what exactly made them feel that way. I think part of our professional conduct is not to apply undue pressure. In other words, you can't shield a purchaser from their environment that they're operating in. If there is competition there and there's urgency, that may cause some stress, but you can't entirely shield a purchaser from that. But harassing them and calling them 34 times and sending them ridiculous text messages, well, clearly that's going too far.
Yeah.
So I think it's very much a specific kind of thing as opposed to a general question.
Yeah, I guess the reason I touched on that is that whole trust thing in real estate. Again, it's like that's one of the areas where there's potentially a breakdown in trust, and part of this conversation is to rebuild some of that. And so do you think there's things that agents can do to prepare purchasers for an auction or for a high pressure environment?
Totally. Yeah, I think that, and love the question. I think it's worthwhile both purchasers and sellers should be asking themselves the what if questions. And in fact, I remember discussing with my brother about a purchase, and I encouraged him to have those difficult conversations. If you want to talk strategies to help a purchaser, for example, at auction, I think one of the best things that a purchaser can do is bid like they've got all the money in the world, but also be very clear about where their boundaries are, because it is easy to get carried away. Ego can take over, emotions can take over. You referenced some research. I know you didn't quote the reference, but I'm familiar with it in the book Thinking Fast and Slow. And there's very much two systems, the logical, slow system, which engages and really requires a lot of effort. And then there's the fast system, which is instinctive and intuitive and often works well, but is ruled by emotion and can get carried away. So I think those are some things to be aware of. And those difficult conversations, if you really want to secure a property, it's worthwhile going, well, what's our fight fund for this? And if you think there's a risk that the property could potentially stretch past what you're financially capable of without achieving a higher approval or securing funds elsewhere or whatever the situation might be, if you really want to buy it, make sure you have those difficult conversations ahead of time so you're not having to scramble or have a heated conversation with your significant other on the day because you just look weak. Whereas if you actually had it and you're well prepared and you've made a conscious decision, then you can just keep firing straight back in their face. And I've seen that put other purchasers off because they go, we're never going to win this. So I think that's a good tactic to use. Yeah,
purchaser strategies are interesting because I've seen a few where people have they've done exactly that and they've just bid, and they're like, we're going to show the other people that we are
mean business.
And we mean business. I've also seen ones where there's been two purchasers bidding, and then it slows down, it cools right off, and then at the very last minute, someone else puts their hand up to try to demoralize everybody else.
Totally. You see all sorts of things, and there'll be heaps of different schools of thought on this. I think, the safest strategy, and it might not be most tricky sounding one, but I think it's the most effective. If you really want to secure a property, I'd say start the bidding, start at a level that you're comfortable at, and then just bid until you reach your max. I know it makes there's nothing cunning about it, but if you bid confidently using that strategy, I know of purchasers who have missed out on property and kind of gone, we didn't get in there. And they probably weren't going to buy it because someone else had more money on the day. But at the same token, I think they regretted the fact that they hadn't engaged in that process. There's almost two sides to that, because there's the idea of, getting comfortable at auction, right? So I would almost think it's a good idea to bid at a few properties that even you don't care too much about because you're going, I just want to familiarize myself, almost like practice in a weird kind of way. I think this is actually, I love the direction of the conversation. I reckon a lot of the things that you and I have talked about already are the same regardless of method of sale. And I think this is applicable in the same way. If you're a purchaser and you want to buy a property and you aren't super experienced, or even if you are, I sold a property the other night, sold at auction, and the purchaser, clearly an accomplished person, but signing the paperwork, the hand is shaking.
Yeah, exactly.
And he noticed it and I noticed it, and he said, that was my adrenaline's still going. And I said, no worries, take your time. And he goes, you do this every day, but I don't.
Exactly.
So I think if you're wanting to buy, then it doesn't hurt to actually go, well, let's actually have a little bit of a practice run and make sure we've got all of our ducks in a row, because it might be that there's something you haven't yet worked out about that purchasing process. Go and have a crack at something.
Yeah, exactly. And then you never know, you might get a good deal that you didn't expect. So no, it is good. It's funny, I tell my friends who are looking at buying at the moment, I say just go make a lot of offers on properties, and if someone accepts one, then figure out if you, it depends if it's an option or not, right? But it's like, it's this idea that, the market is falling at the moment. From a purchaser's perspective, there are good deals on the market because there's people who need to sell.
Yeah. It's a really interesting time for us to be recording this. I'm trying to make, my advice and perspective really specific to the time of recording.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because a falling market, generally speaking, is probably only, maybe 1/6 of the time in a real estate market. There are times where it's a little more stable, and there are a lot of times where there's a slow incline upwards. So it'll be interesting to revisit this in a different environment.
Totally, yeah. I mean, in the past, people had a fear of paying too much. Now they have a fear of missing out. Oh, sorry, other way around. In the past, there was a fear of missing out. Now buyers have a fear of paying too much.
Yeah. I'll put it this way. I think it's as far as advice to purchasers buying, I think you want to try and time your purchase. If you forget your situation, which you shouldn't, in the sense that, the right time to buy is when it's right for your situation. But if you're just going, how do I time the market? Here are some things to look out for. Have a look at the amount of inventory on market and the number of transactions per month. Everyone looks at what's prices doing. Prices follow those things. So the canary in the coal mine for prices falling is the volume of transactions falling. And you'll see that will have happened already for a lot of places, and others where the market hasn't really dropped. Agents are telling me that the number of transactions are falling. So I'm going, that to me predicts that prices are likely to creep downwards as well. And the same thing will happen as we see the volume of transactions start to pick up. That's off the back of increased buyer activity. And often to me, that's a signal of that's the bottom, and things could potentially start to tickle away.
Yeah, exactly. And as you're saying that, it's this idea that the reason transactions are slowing down is not necessarily because of the number of it's the number of properties on the market is a reflection of that, but it's because vendors' expectations remain high while the market's turning. And so there's that adjustment period, right? And so transactions will decrease because purchasers are now only prepared to pay X amount of dollars, but the vendors' expectations are still up here. And so therefore the number of transactions drops, which is in direct correlation to property prices dropping.
Yeah, obviously this is a massive topic with lots of different opinions on it. But to me, the real simple things to watch, to me, there's a direct inverse relationship between interest rates and house prices. When interest rates are going up, house prices are coming down. When interest rates are going down, house prices are going up. And then the other piece to that, real simple, is watching the volume of transactions. So you want to know what's a hot market look like in terms of the number of transactions, and what is a cold market. And actually everything just depends on your perspective. If you're out there and you're well capitalized, I'd say now is a brilliant time to be buying, because depending on the market, but certainly in the Auckland area, there's been massive price hits, and sure, there might be a little bit further to fall, but I think probably in the context of the price falls in general, we're probably already pretty close to the bottom. And so now I would say is a great time, especially if you're a purchaser. I'm not just talking to people who want to pick up investments or maybe developments, but if you're a person that wants to buy a property and you plan to live in it, or if you're an investor who's looking for a specific type of property, there's never a better time to buy than when you don't have a huge amount of competition, because sure, you may still need to pay a fair price. However, you're likely able to secure the property that you want, versus a situation where either you're competing in a blind situation with you or in a transparent forum with me or someone else doing auction, and you're up against 7 or 8 other people, and it might just blow past what you're able to go to.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think it's why people are buying as well. Like if you need to move because you got a new job or something like that, then the difference in $50,000 or something, for argument's sake, so that you can move on with your life, it's, what's that really worth?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a pretty tough topic to hit. If you've purchased a property in the last couple of years and for whatever reason need to sell, it's not a pleasant situation if there's been significant price reductions. Yeah,
I mean, that's another thing altogether, right? For people who bought 2 years ago at the peak of the market, or a year and a half, and now property prices have come back, interest rates are going up, their mortgages are coming up for renewal, and suddenly the amount of interest they're paying is going to double or triple in some cases. Should they be selling now before that happens? It's a big...
Yeah, that question very specific to each situation. Weighted, and to be fair, this is if you trust a real estate agent that can give you a bit of guidance on where you are, and it should be a conversation in the context of what your cash flow looks like. I think. I remember 2007, I purchased a property, and that was pretty much the top of the market. Right. So I've been through that situation of buying very much at the top of the market. And then if I had to sell, I would have lost not only my deposit, but I still would have owed money to the bank. But then in the context of the market kind of recovering, several years later, but the property was worth more than what I'd purchased it for.
Yeah, so you were able to write it out.
Totally. So I think that it always comes down to, what is the transaction for? What's the purpose of that? And if this is an essential thing to offload some debt so that you're not crushed completely, then whilst it might not look great on paper, it's probably still a good decision. That said, if you've got the ability to continue to remain liquid and ride it out and you'd rather not sell it, well then, I think time in the market is the key, not timing the market.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I like that. And I think for anyone who does have to sell, one of the biggest barriers is comparing what they bought for. And there's this idea that it's not actually about what you bought for, it's about what you can do once you sell. So it's like, if I sell now, I could buy again in 6 months for less. Let's say the property market kept dropping. And so even still, if you can time it, but say because you have to sell, if you can write it out, I'm in total agreement. You go through and you come out the other side, the property market will keep going up. There's limited supply of land at the end of the day. But if you do have to sell, then timing it so that you can sell and then buy if the market was still on its way down, then you can still end up in a better position than you are today, even if it's not better than you were a year ago.
Yeah, you got to protect your downside for sure. And I think it's an interesting one. In a rapidly growing market, the smartest people purchase and then sell.
Yeah.
In a declining market, of course, it's better to sell first and then purchase. Yeah. The danger is when there's a rapid reversal. And certainly, that shift that we had around October 2021, in my career, I've been in the business almost 20 years, that would be the most rapid reversal I've seen of market conditions in that entire time. So definitely caught some people on the hop. And there's a possibility that we'll see the same on the bottom, but I think it's unlikely. But you make sure you do your own thinking about
people
this.
Need to do their own research.
Exactly. You've got to make
their local agent.
Exactly. Own your own decisions. But you should have an opinion about it, and you should stress test that. Like if you've got a perspective, then stress test it with someone believable. That might be a salesperson, it might be a trusted friend, or someone with some experience, but worthwhile to go, okay, here's what I think. Now convince me I'm wrong.